Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Just Tamika. Well, we are squarely in the middle of Mental Health Awareness Month. That's May for you for those of you who may not be aware. Also, this is American Pacific Islander Heritage Month as well. So, celebrate along with our brethren and sisters of that culture. I wanted to share some things that I've been experiencing this past Mental Health Awareness Month. Um, my church, Eastside Church of God in Christ, located in Stockton, had our annual Youth Day of Awareness Conference. Now, this is an event that we put on every year. We allow the young people in our youth department to choose topics that they feel like are impactful for the youth. And then we go and we get speakers to come and speak on those topics and give information. We try to make it a family friendly day, not just for the youth, but for their caregivers, their guardians, so that they can learn alongside with the youth. But ultimately, the goal is to make sure these young people come away with something and that they are able to speak into a space. It's supposed to be a safe space for them to feel loved on and supported. So we had a very good one. I mean, the young people showed up this time. I'm so glad and so just godly pleased at the outcome. Um, the young people didn't show up just, physically, but they showed up with their whole selves, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. So what started out as workshops became real conversations around real topics. Some of the topics were trauma, um, the pressures of academia, social media, and relationships. And I'll tell you what, honestly, I walked away realizing something. Young people are carrying way more than adults realize. But when we create those intentional spaces, they'll talk. This wasn't about entertainment, it wasn't about checking off another church event. It became something deeper. And what blessed me most was watching these young people feel safe enough to speak honestly. And I'm going to tell you that matters because sometimes the most impactful ministry doesn't happen from a stage. Sometimes it happens in conversations. Sometimes healing begins when somebody finally feels heard. One another thing that stood out to me was that the topics that the youth selected were um, things that were important to them. So this is not us adults deciding what we think they need, but these are the youth telling us directly what impacted their lives. The topics, as I mentioned, were impacts of trauma, time management for students, student academic success, social media, and protecting your peace, and healthy relationships. And these youth had a lot to say. They didn't ask for fluff, they asked for tools. And that hit me deeply because it tells us that young people are aware of the pressures they're under. They know they're struggling with balance. They know social media affects them. They know relationships can be complicated and they want guidance. As a therapist, one thing that I think adults sometimes misunderstand is what trauma looks like in young people. Trauma isn't always one major catastrophic event. Sometimes trauma looks like that constant pressure, that building. Other times it may look like family instability. It might look like feeling emotionally alone. And I think many of us realize that you can feel alone in a crowd. You can feel alone at a school. You can feel alone when you should be surrounded by those that you think are safe. It's about connection. Nothing happens without connection. Sometimes for these young people, trauma might look like bullying. It might look like being exposed to adult situations too early. And that's not something that we talk about. We don't talk about people who've been exposed to these things. We don't talk about people who may have been abused or hurt or harmed or just having to see things that they shouldn't have to see as young people. Trauma could also look like never feeling good enough. It could be carrying anxiety while trying to perform academically. Some youth are trying to succeed academically while silently grieving. That's real, y'all. And what encouraged me during this conference was seeing young people engage in conversations around healing instead of pretending that everything is okay. And let me tell you, healing is a holy work. So, as I said, one of the workshops specifically focused on social media and how to use it without letting it use you. And we know that's a very necessary conversation. This was presented by one of our ministers at our church. He is a young man himself, and so he knows the dangers of social media. What I do like about his delivery was he had a way of sharing and helping these young people to understand that yes, social media is a thing. It is normal, but just exploring some of the pitfalls. What happens when it's affecting your self confidence? What happens when you're using it to compare yourself to other people and it's causing you to feel less than? What happens when you're doom scrolling and it's affecting your sleep, your peace, or just your ability to be productive, right? And so he didn't beat the young people over the head with it. He didn't tell them, oh, you need to not use social media, get off those phones. No, he was very real. He was very open. He was very honest. He talked about how social media impacted him and how he realized that, oh my gosh, I'm spending too much time on this phone. He gave some tools about how somebody could begin to find that balance. He suggested maybe setting a timer on your phone. And so I'm gonna let myself be on, I don't know, TikTok or Instagram or Facebook, whatever your mode of media is these days. And I'm gonna set a timer for 15 minutes. And when that's done, I'm gonna go ahead and get back to what I'm doing, right? And so that way you're giving yourself the opportunity to scroll and get a little bit in, but you're holding yourself accountable. And so he talked about how there's nothing wrong with being on your phone, but that we want to be really careful that we're not being out of balance. And so the young people really seemed to respond to that as well. Social media is shaping identity, confidence, and relationships, as well as people's self worth and attention spans in real time. And while social media can be a powerful tool, it could also become emotionally draining. I'm gonna tell y'all, comparison culture is real, as is validation addiction and doom scrolling. These are things that I think we've all been guilty of, but it behooves us to just really kind of pay attention and want to be our fully best selves. So if an app profits from your attention, then protecting your peace becomes spiritual warfare. Young people need spaces where they can disconnect from performance and reconnect with authenticity. I had we had another of our young men from our church do a different presentation. He talked about the time management for students, and he talked about the reality of what it's like to not only be in school but just be productive. There are some days where you show up, and if you are not organized, you're all over the place, right? He talked about uh, just really being laid back and what that's like. There are some dangers to that. There's nothing wrong with being laid back. That might be a personality style. But if you're on a mission, if you are working or if you have things that need to get done, that can easily become a landslide of just not being able to be productive. It's a booby trap, y'all. So if you are the type of people who are laid back and you just don't typically plan out your whole week, that's fine. But do make sure that you have some goals. Set some small goals. He also talked about he gave some really good tools too. One thing that I came away with that I know that I'll be using is I think it's called the Pomodoro method, where you set a timer. Maybe you work steadily for about 25 minutes. You set a timer, you take a 5-minute break, you get up, you step away from what you're doing, but you come back to it. So that way you stay productive, but you're also getting your breaks. I think that was one that I hadn't heard before, and it was really impactful. But I think that the most impactful part of the day was the relationship rap session. So one of the church members who I was speaking with had a discussion with her grandkids, and she shared how that sparked a conversation worth having in this space. She said that she was talking to her grandkids around relationships, and they had a lot to say. So we decided to lean into that and have a rap session at the end of this day. And we did. We gathered the young people in chairs, we circled up, and we told them how this idea came about. And we really honestly didn't expect them to be very forthcoming. We thought they were going to think, oh, yeah, these are just adults. Here they go again telling us this. But when I tell you these young people had a lot to say, they talked so much about relationships and healthy relationships. Some of the things that stand out to me that I remember, one man, well, it's one young lady, first of all, spoke about the dating culture and how she feels like everybody is in such a rush to do what they think they should do. You get a boyfriend or girlfriend because you think you should do it. They're checking off boxes instead of going for a connection. And so I thought that was very insightful. Wow, right? Young people talking about a connection over anything else. And so she's somebody who decided she will not be forced into anything. She's not going to get into a relationship because she thinks she should, or that's what people her age do. And so that was really relevant. We had another young man who talked about um, just how the pressures of dating are in his grade. You know, he's a young man in college, he's gone through high school, he's in his, I believe, his second year in college. But he talked freely about navigating relationships and how uh, he's expected as a young man to put his feelings aside. You know, he's supposed to see about his girlfriend's feelings, but you know, he's not allowed to have feelings. If he does react to something or say, I need a minute, then he's belittled or told, oh, well, you're less than a man, you're being a girl, you're being gay, you're being all these other things, right? There's a set of masculinity that he's trying to navigate. And what he said to me that was so powerful was that, you know, a lot of times in these spaces, some of these young men are still being nurtured at home by their parents, and you're expected to fulfill the role of a man in this relationship to this young lady. And you know, I challenged him to think about that. That's real. I had to accept it. And I agree that wow, this is a lot of pressure for them to have to figure out who they are. They're still growing up, and now I have to be what the world says a man is, right? And I can't show my feelings, or I can't have feelings. I can't have my feelings validated. And you know, one thing that really struck me was that wow, these young kids are trying to fulfill the role of a husband or a wife because at that level, as a boyfriend or girlfriend, there are certain things you shouldn't be trying to stand up to or forgive. There are levels, and I think that we have to take the time to have these conversations so that young people can know and realize and recognize that yeah, you know, you need a minute to just what does it really look like? What does it look like to be a woman? What does it look like to be a man? What does it look like to be a man or woman in a relationship? And then what does it look like to be in a marriage? Because the things that you do in a marriage are not benefits that you should be giving away to somebody that you're simply dating. And I'm not simply talking about sex. I'm talking about, you know, paying somebody's bills. I'm talking about being somebody's everything. You didn't sign up for that until you said I do. And so we need to be having these discussions with our young people. Another young person talked about uh, dating culture having this laissez faire uh, thinking about cheating. You know, he spoke strongly about how a lot of times, you know, these young ladies are not always trustworthy and they're out there cheating. Or if you guys hit a rough patch, there's that quote unquote friend who's standing in the wings waiting to step in, right? And another young lady who talked about, yeah, well, sometimes these young men are you know, wanting to you to be faithful, but then they're cheating all over the place, and then they come back to you expecting you to be that faithful young lady. And so there was a good dialogue around that, and the youth really seemed to hear each other. Nobody was belittling. It didn't end in arguments. It was just a really good dialogue. It was so good, guys, that they went over time, and I'm like, oh, maybe there's an opportunity for other space. So I mean, talking circles are really healing, they're really powerful, and the youth really seemed to be uh, in agreement that they would like to have more of these talking circles, whether that looks like having sister circles or having the fellas come together, or if it's a mixed group like this one. So, really excited to be looking at and exploring what that could look like. How do we provide these spaces further for the youth? What else do they need to talk about? What's on their minds? What's on their hearts? And so I ask you all to be in prayer with me as the Lord deals with these young people and just, you know, give us something that is a safe place for them to be able to, a safe place and a soft place to land and be able to really process these things so they can go back into the world refreshed. You know, it was a really natural and honest discussion, but I think that only happens when youth feel safe enough to participate. You know, um, we didn't talk about red flags and toxic behavior, but those are things that are obviously on their minds. We did talk about lightly about the expectation of, you know, pressures of sex when you're not ready. you know, what are some things? And so we also wanted to make sure that we wrapped it up, not leaving the youth with just a list of problems, but hey, we are all the answer to somebody else's problem. This is this, we are each other's safe space. So what does this look like? How do we further this? And so I tell you, I come away feeling just exhilarated and inspired about these young people. I was able to make some good connections. So hopefully this will be something that takes on a life of its own as we move forward. It reminded me of something important. Many young people are learning about relationships from social media instead of healthy real life examples. And that's why another reason these conversations matter. Sometimes youth don't need adults to fix everything. Sometimes they need adults who can sit in hard conversations without shutting them down. So, what I saw this week, it gave me hope. Not because our youth have all the answers, but because they're willing to ask real questions. Maybe healing starts there. Maybe awareness starts there. Certainly, prevention and community start there. Not with pretending, not with perfection, but with honest conversation. If we really want to support young people, we have to become safe enough to hear them. Yeah, I want to thank you all for listening to Just Tamika. Please continue checking in on our young people, continuing to create safe spaces, and listening with compassion. Remember, our next generation isn't asking to be perfect, they're asking us to be present. If this episode spoke to you, feel free to share it with a parent, educator, youth leader, or somebody who works with young people. And if your church, organization, or community wants to create more emotionally safe spaces for youth conversation, keep doing the work. It matters more than you know. Well, thank you, friends. And as always, I am just Tamika.